Hi, Sachsenhausen. Polonia gwarna, parna, Germania richtig dicker Heil. Sachsenhausen. Wirtycie jak bambusik, trupie łebki to kaktusy heil. Es lebe kule der Kampf.
Welcome to Descendants Stuff, a podcast by and for the descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners, working together to uncover the unanswered questions of its history. Sachsenhausen was a Nazi concentration camp located in Oranienburg, Germany, used from 1936 through April 1945. It was used as a labor camp, with a network of subcamps and worksites around the region, as well as a prison camp, death camp, medical experimentation center, and SS training ground. It was also the administrative center for all Nazi concentration camps. We are Jakob, Kelsey, and Nicole, three descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners. Though our relatives were imprisoned for different reasons, we've discovered we have much in common. In each episode, we interview other descendants, researchers, and even survivors, sharing stories, memories, and research to build a clearer picture of the past, one that goes beyond the records. Through these conversations, we honor those who suffered and died at Sachsenhausen and strengthen our collective understanding of our own ancestors' experiences. We are here at the 81st commemoration of the liberation of Sachsenhausen concentration camp. We're in Tower A in our temporary podcast studio. I'm here with Claudio Altenhain. Claudio, welcome. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me, Nicole.
As I understand, your great-grandfather was imprisoned here in Sachsenhausen.
Yeah, it's true.
Yes. What was his name?
His name was Fritz Altenhein.
Fritz Altenhain. And where was he born?
He was born in a small town which does not exist nowadays anymore, and I will tell you why. The town's name was Asel. It was situated in the north of the state of Hessen in Germany. It doesn't exist anymore because nowadays there's an artificial lake, a dammed lake, to produce energy, which did not exist when my grandfather was born. He was born there in 1893. He was born into a poor, humble family. His mother died when he was 6 or 7 years old.
Do you know anything about his early life?
He was humble and a poor family, and he finished his school. So it's like a basic German school, like no higher education. And he did an apprenticeship and he became a locksmith. He was a learned locksmith, which potentially or probably also saved his life or enabled him to survive for 5 years in Sachsenhausen later on because he was a qualified worker. And he participated in World War I as a soldier. I don't know for sure where he fought, but yeah, he returned with an Iron Cross. So he received like some kind of a basic medal for heroship or whatever. And that's an interesting detail. Right after World War I, he joined a so-called Freikorps. And the Freikorps, these were fighting corps, like paramilitary troops, paramilitary right-wing reactionary groups who were formed of former soldiers, war veterans. And apparently he fought with the German Freikorps in the Baltics, so maybe the Russian Civil War, I'm not sure. In the early 20s, it seems as if he was sort of like very, very right-leaning. And I know hardly anything about this episode in his life, but it's an interesting footnote, if you want to call it that. Then he returned to Germany in the early 1920s and he settled in Korbach. And Korbach is a town of, back then it must have had like 10 or 15,000 inhabitants. It's also in the north of the state of Hessen. And he started working in a factory there and founded a family.
You mentioned earlier, you said he was in Sachsenhausen for 5 years.
Yes.
So he was in World War I. He was part of the Freikorps.
Yeah.
Afterwards, he came back to Germany. He settled down. He had a family.
Yeah.
What happened that led up to that time?
Yeah. He found a family, had 3 children, born in 1923, 1925, and 1927. And the youngest child was my grandfather, Heinz. And he became engaged in local politics. Obviously, it was a working class family, and they had very little money. my great-grandfather became affiliated with the Communist Party. And he was elected a member of the city council for the Communist Party. And he would serve as a member of the city council for the Communist Party until 1933, when the Communist Party was illegalized by the National Socialists. And and then he continued to, so there was a cell of communist underground fighters, if you want to call it that, in this town where he used to live. And they would continue to agitate the people. And one day in 1937, shortly before my grandfather's 10th birthday, my great-grandfather was brought home by the Gestapo. They had approached him while he was at work and took him to his home, and they searched his house. And they found the printing press at the attic, found the printing press for the communist leaflets they would pass out. First, he was brought to the Gestapo Central in Kassel, which was the capital of, I think, was the Reichsgau, like former NS subdivision of Kurhessen-Kassel. And so there was the Gestapo Central, and they brought him there, and he was tortured. Then he was sent to prison, also Zuchthaus, that's how it was called, in Kassel. And there was a trial against him and the other members of the communist cell, and he was sentenced for treason and all these kinds of things. And I think he was sentenced for 3.5 years of prison or something like that. So he spent this time in prison. The time spent in prison is relatively well documented. My family succeeded in accessing the documents. And so you still have, for instance, the files with the handwriting of my great-grandfather, where he wrote down all the items, the personal items he had brought along with him. And there is also letters between him and my great-grandmother or my great-grandmother. I don't remember anymore. Yeah, and then shortly before he was supposed to be released, he was brought to the concentration camp in February 1940. And from then onwards, there is hardly any documentation left of him. So other than the cell block where he was detained, there is, other than the barracks where he was detained here in Sachsenhausen, there's hardly any documentation. The only thing which is then again documented is, I think, some documentation of the death march in which he was forced to participate when the camp was dissolved. So the last trace of him, in the Nazi documentation, is that he was still around at Belorwald, apparently. And then he was liberated by the Soviet army.
And you mentioned he was in Sachsenhausen for 5 years?
Yes.
And he was near the end of he was about to be released, or near the end of his prison term when he was brought here. So he was imprisoned for over 8 years between the prison and the concentration camp.
Altogether. So he was imprisoned in early 1937. Altogether, he spent 3 years in prison and over 5 years at concentration camp. He has suffered a lot of traumatizing hardship. So that's for sure.
Here in Sachsenhausen, labeled as a political prisoner for being communist, part of the Communist Party.
Yeah, he was political prisoner here in Sachsenhausen. As mentioned before, there's no documentation of this time between 1940 and 1945. And I think that the fact that he was a learned locksmith must have facilitated somehow his time here at Sachsenhausen, because he wouldn't be forced to work at the brick factory and so on. What I know from what my grandfather told me, who was also a very avid family and local amateur historian, if you want to call it that, is that once when my great-grandmother hadn't heard of my great-grandfather for quite a while, she would write a letter to the camp overseer of the SS here in Sachsenhausen. And she was desperate to know about my great-grandfather, and if he was still alive, and if he was doing well, and if he needed anything, and so on. And the next letter my great-grandmother received, or the family received from my great-grandfather, he would implore my great-grandmother to never write again, to never ask about him again, because he was beaten up. He was severely punished for his wife asking so shamelessly about her husband and about how he was doing, and for taken away the time for getting on the nerves of the camp overseer, basically. That's one episode I know. Yeah, and so he was released by the Soviet army, and due to his political experiencedness as a member of the city council in Korbach, and also for being a communist, he was then for a short while employed by the Soviets in order to prepare the ground reform in the Soviet-occupied area. So, I mean, they would redistribute the farming land, and my great-grandfather participated in this for half a year or something. And then he would finally come back to his family in early 1946.
And you mentioned that your grandfather, his son,
Yes.
his youngest son, had an interest in history. Was he trying to find out more about what had happened to him? Was he the one who started looking for the documentation in your family?
Yeah, that's also, I think, interesting, I guess. So my grandfather was 9 years old when my great-grandfather was taken prisoner or detained by the Gestapo. And my grandfather was a very good pupil, and he was a smart person, but he wasn't allowed to go at the gymnasium any longer. His father being a communist, the family was being punished, and so his son, my grandfather, could not finish that kind of school, which would then enable you to go to college or to university.
Was this while he was imprisoned? Or after?
Yeah, I guess the decision was made while my grandfather was still in prison before he was sent to the concentration camp. But my grandfather then, he was very successful at the Hitler Youth. So he was actually the leader of the Hitler Youth in Korbach, in this town where my grandfather was born. So he became a very avid and convinced little Nazi. He became a soldier, evidently, as well. So he was part of that kind of last line of defense. So he was 18 years old when the war finished in 1945. He wasn't sent to the front anymore, even though he urgently wanted to. Fortunately, he was caught by American troops before he could make it to the Eastern Front. That's where he wanted to go and defend the Reich against the Russians. I think that's what he had in mind back then. And then he became an American POW and was released in early 1946, more or less simultaneously with his father. And he very soon understood that National Socialism was a pretty fucked up thing. And yeah, so, and he became then very soon very active in local history and family history as well. And there was one episode, my grandfather also wrote some kind of a personal autobiography, if you want to call it that, also for his own family, for his grandchildren like me, for instance. And there's one episode he wrote down, he said that he literally was crying when he wrote this down, that there was, in fact, a Jewish family who were clients of my great-grandmother. So my great-grandmother, she was doing laundry, basically. She had a laundromat and she was doing laundry for other families and earning some money with this. And one day when the daughter of that Jewish family would bring the laundry to get it laundered by my great-grandmother, my grandfather would send away the daughter and doing like this Hitler thing and raising the right arm and telling her that they would not do the laundry for Jewish families any longer. And I guess he must have said this when he was like 12 or 13 years old or something. And he was, I think for the rest of his life, he felt very, very ashamed about this. And it was a very, and until the end of his life, I think it was a very painful thing for him to confront himself with this, even though I would say it's not his fault, right? Because he was so young and he was so heavily indoctrinated. But I think for him, that was one of the reasons amongst many others to start committing himself to local history and also especially remembering the fate of the Jewish community in the town where he was born, because they were all deported, right? And after World War II, in this place where my grandfather was born and brought up, there was a high-ranking Nazi criminal who was actually an assistant to Eichmann. And he had been taken prisoner for a while, but he was released for some reasons. And he was then able to establish a little grocery shop in this specific town. Pretty much everyone knew about it, but nobody wanted to know about it. And my grandfather was getting very angry about this fact that this guy was able to live a totally normal life without being taken charge for the crimes he committed. But then in the end, this person was sanctioned for participating in the crimes of National Socialism, but yeah, with a very minor sanction. So, I mean, there was this strong continuity of the heritage of National Socialism also in the town where my grandfather was born, and my grandfather had a very strong consciousness about the depth of guilt and of shame.
So your great-grandfather was imprisoned for 8.5 years between the prison and the concentration camp. He was on the death march, and at the same time, his own son was looking to fight the same forces that were later to come and liberate your great-grandfather.
Yeah, exactly.
Did they have a relationship after the war ended?
They did, but it was complicated because the family broke up, basically. I mean, when my great-grandfather returned to his family, there was just no way to sustain the marriage or to sustain the family or to maintain it, if you want to call it that. And my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother did not get along with each other any longer. My great-grandfather then had another relationship with another woman, and so it was a complicated relationship between my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather, and so for my grandfather it was also not so easy to manage all this. Yeah, but I think they did have a relationship, but my great-grandfather never talked about what he had experienced, neither in prison and especially not in Sachsenhausen at the camp. And it was further complicated due to the fact that my grandfather got married to a woman, to my grandmother, who had been driven out of Breslau, which is today Wrocław in Poland, right? So from Silesia. And she was from a Nazi family, some kind of Nazi upper class family, and they had to flee from the Soviet army. And so her father, my other great-grandfather, he wouldn't say explicitly Nazi things after 1945, but he was involved. And that was also a known fact. And I know that within this family, between this one great-grandfather and the other great-grandfather, there was a strong tension, obviously.
Just within the one family, it's such a complicated history. Within the complex history of all the things that were happening at that time, how do you think that's affected through generations to your family today?
Most certainly. I mean, I don't want to sound overly metaphysic, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma, but I certainly do not suffer from it. Certainly not. I wouldn't even make a claim for this because that would be ridiculous. But I've been thinking myself about why I seem to have a certain sensitivity for certain topics and why I tend to be sensitive about certain aspects of history and also certain aspects of our political present. And I do think that the fact that there has been this history in my family, which I wouldn't even say it's not extraordinary history, it's just like a German family history. I think it was a pretty common thing. So you have Nazis in every family, in pretty much every family. And you also have some people who were victims of National Socialism. And so I think that's pretty common. I think what was different in my case maybe is the fact that my grandfather was so committed to dealing with this history, trying to keep the memory alive. And I think also my mother was raised in this kind of consciousness or self-understanding. And so if you want to call that, I think it would be fair to say that in a way it was handed down to me, even though I guess so far I've not been practically committed to taking part in keeping the memory of National Socialism alive as you guys do.
What questions are still unanswered for you? What are you still hoping to learn about your family history, your great-grandfather's history and his time, during his time here in Sachsenhausen?
Well, obviously, it would very much interest me to know what kind of a person he was in the camp, because obviously I want to believe that he was acting in a good way given the circumstances under which he found himself. Because if you know that somebody survived 5 years in Sachsenhausen, you perforce ask yourself, so how did that happen? How did he manage? There's this one history that apparently when he came back home, he was received by a local Jewish family who was standing at the railway station and taking him home by car because he had helped them or their family in the camp. And when I heard this, I was relieved, right? Because that sort of shows to me that he can't have been a terrible person at the camp. Yeah, but this is lost. It cannot be accessed any further, and it's a shame, but it's the way it is. I think something which would be important for me to know would be, for instance, to know what my other great-grandfather was doing in this time. Because there are some members of my family apparently had mentioned that's an issue which should not be touched upon, and people would refuse to talk about it. So there might be very, very nasty things involved in my other part of the family. And I wonder if there's still any way to find out more about this. I think that would be more the direction I would have to direct my attention to, maybe.
We're here in Tower A, overlooking the camp, the memorial site. We see people coming and going when we're in here doing our podcast or learning about the history of the camp. How do you feel being in here and seeing the camp, as a whole? Like, what does this bring up for you?
I mean, obviously, it's the first time for me to be up here. I've visited the memorial before, but so this specific place is not accessible for common visitors. So for me, it's the first time to be up here. It's scary. It's absolutely scary because it inevitably puts you in the position of the perpetrators. It puts you in the position of somebody whose job it was to kill people, basically, to maintain order by killing people. And there's something suggestive about it, as it were, because the very architecture inevitably provides you with this, shall I say, with this rush of control and of oversight. I think that's pretty scary. And it makes you think about sort of what the preconditions are to enable a certain kind of behavior, right? The social preconditions, but also maybe the architectural, spatial preconditions, and how a certain behavior which is abhorrent and profoundly wrong and disgusting can be made logical and almost natural. By which I totally do not mean to excuse the insane cruelty of the people who were involved in here. I mean, it's still a question of ideology, it's still a question of convictions and so on. Just to not get me wrong, right? I mean, there's also something specific about, there's a reason which brought the people here who did their work, in quotation marks, up here. I'm asking myself, how susceptible might I be for doing such kinds of things? That's what I ask myself when I'm up here.
I just have one more question for you. I'm curious if there's anything that you would want other descendants to know.
Other descendants to know?
Other descendants.
I would like them to know that I would be glad to get to know them and to learn about their histories and their family histories. And I would like to tell them that if they are committed in keeping that memory alive, I'm very grateful for this commitment of theirs. And I will be pleased to join their practice. That's what I would like to tell them.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Descendants Stuff podcast is produced by Jakob Feistauer, Kelsey Snook, and Nicole Wines, 3 descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners and co-creators of the Sachsenhausen Stuff project. The Descendants Stuff team would like to extend a special thank you to the team at Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum, especially Dr. Astrid Lai and the members of the Educational Department's project, What Voice Do We Have?, as well as the Descendants Collective Voices of the Next Generation. The theme song, Heil Sachsenhausen, was written by Alexander Kulisiewicz while he was imprisoned at Sachsenhausen and performed by him after the war. It is used with permission from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Kulisiewicz collection. If you are a Sachsenhausen descendant who would like to share your story, please contact us through our website at www.sachsenhausen-stuff.com or use the Contact Us link in the show notes below.
Heil Sachsenhausen. A jak będę jutro wzdychał lewą nóżką, ci zawtikam. Heil, es lebe Gold, o Kampf.